Decorators are a feature of Python that utilizes higher order functions. Here's the idea. Let's start out with some just regular functions. Let's just square and sum squares up to n that starts with k at 1 and total at 0. And while k is less than or equal to n, it adds to total and changes k. So we're going to square the current k and then bind k to k plus 1. And then we'll return the total. So we can square 12 and we can sum squares up to 5 to get 55. Okay, so I told you about this trace decorator, and a decorator is a name for this thing that looks like at and then a name. And when I use that and I square something, then I see something gets printed before the value returns. So first line gets printed when it gets called, another line gets printed when it returns. Let's actually implement trace, or a simpler version. So we're going to implement a function called trace1, which takes another function in. And what it does is it returns a version of fun, a function, that first prints before it is called. And fun is a function of one argument, which is why we call this trace1. Okay, so what's going to happen? Well, I'll define a traced version of the function, which will first print calling this function on argument and then the argument. And then it will actually return the value of calling fun on x. And then we'll return that traced function. So traced is just like fun, except for it also prints. And now I can annotate square with the trace1 function that I just wrote. We're not using the one that's built in anymore. Which means that when I square 12, it will say calling the square function on argument 12. Moreover, I can trace multiple different functions, and then when I sum squares up to 5, I can see all the work that happened. So we called sum squares up to on the argument 5, which involved calling square on 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4 and then 5 and then returning 55. Neat. So trace is the same thing. Decorating a function with trace is exactly the same thing as if I had written down here square is the result of calling trace1 on square. I'll get the same behavior. So if you want a shortcut for transforming a function into another function, you can just put an annotation, which is called a decorator. So if I trace a function, that's called the decorator. What you get back is a decorated function, and it's bound to the name of the function that's given. So this is identical to first defining the function and then rebinding the name of the function to a traced version of that function. Why not just use that? Well, it's a little bit extra to type, and it's nice to know up front what decorations you apply to a function. It's just a more natural place to put them. But probably most of all, it's like that because not all Python programmers understand higher order functions. But it's easy for everybody to understand the magic of a decorator. So for you, it's not magic, but for other people, it may be.